Good evening and welcome to the Sleepy Biographer. You've got nothing to do but rest. Let your breathing slow and your thoughts grow light. Because tonight, we aren't simply learning about a philosopher. We're walking beside him through the cobblestone streets of Königsberg, through lecture halls filled with eager students, through decades of methodical thought that would reshape Western philosophy forever. Immanuel Kant was not just a thinker. He was a revolutionary who never left his hometown, a man whose rigidly ordered life became the foundation for ideas of radical freedom, a philosopher who believed that reason itself could save humanity from darkness. He studied the stars and the structure of knowledge, the nature of beauty, and the foundations of right and wrong. He believed that human beings possessed dignity simply by being rational creatures, that morality was written not in holy books, but in the fabric of reason itself. Some of what you hear tonight may surprise you. Some may spark a question or a memory. But mostly I hope it helps you drift gently into sleep, cradled by the rhythm of a life lived in pursuit of understanding. And just before we begin, if these calm, curious explorations help you unwind or give you a quiet way to end your day, consider liking and subscribing to the channel. It helps others find their way here too. One sleepy soul at a time. Immanuel Kant was born on April 22, 1724, in the city of Königsberg, then part of the Kingdom of Prussia. Today the city is called Kaliningrad and lies within Russia, but in Kant's time it was a German-speaking port on the Baltic Sea, a place where ships carried news from distant lands and merchants gathered to discuss commerce and ideas. It was not one of Europe's great capitals, not Paris or London or Vienna, but it was a busy university town, positioned at the edge of the known world, where forests stretched east for hundreds of miles. And it was here, in this modest but intellectually active city, that Kant would spend his entire life, never venturing beyond its borders, yet somehow managing to see further than men who had crossed oceans. Kant was born Immanuel Kant, with an E, the spelling his parents chose at his baptism. He later changed it to Immanuel after learning Hebrew, a small detail that reflects his lifelong attention to precision. His father, Johann Georg Kant, was a master harness maker, a craftsman who worked in leather and metal. It was honest, dignified work, though not the work of scholars or gentlemen. The family lived modestly and at times struggled financially, occasionally relying on relatives to get by. Even so, they were never destitute. Young Immanuel grew up in a household that valued hard work, honesty, and independence. His mother, Anna Regina, was herself the daughter of a harness maker, but was unusually well educated for a woman of her class. She could read and write, and she possessed what her son would later describe as a genuine religiosity, not enthusiastic or showy, but deep and sincere. The Kant family were pietists, followers of an austere branch of Lutheranism that emphasized personal piety, humility, and a direct relationship with God over ritual and ceremony. Pietism stressed the inner life, the cultivation of virtue through self-examination and discipline, and it distrusted worldly pleasure. Young Immanuel was raised in this tradition, attending prayers and services and learning to distrust vanity and indulgence. By most accounts, though, he never embraced the emotional fervor of pietism. He respected his parents deeply and never spoke against their faith. But something in him resisted the self-abnegation, the reliance on divine grace that the movement demanded. It may be that even as a child, Kant was forming the convictions that would define his mature philosophy, that human beings should rely on their own reason, and that autonomy and self-determination were the highest human goods. His pietist upbringing taught him discipline and moral seriousness, but it also planted a desire for intellectual freedom and a determination to think for himself. When Kant was 8 years old, His mother's pastor, Franz Albert Schulz, recognized something in the boy. Schulz was himself a pietist, but also an educated man who believed in the power of learning. And he convinced Kant's parents to send their son to the Collegium Fridericianum, a prestigious Latin school that Schulz himself directed. For a harness maker's son, this was an extraordinary opportunity. The Collegium Fridericianum was a rigorous institution where students studied Latin and Greek, rhetoric and logic, in preparation for university and a life of the mind. Kant spent 8.5 years there, from age 8 to just past 16. The discipline was severe, and the atmosphere oppressively pious. Students rose early for prayers and were constantly reminded of their sinfulness. Kant later spoke of these years with little affection, finding the relentless religiosity stifling. Even so, he thrived academically, falling in love with Latin, particularly the work of the Roman poet Lucretius, whose naturalistic philosophy opened new worlds to him. The discipline shaped habits of mind that would serve him for the rest of his life. Kant's mother died in 1737, when he was 13. Her death left a hole in the household that young Immanuel had to navigate while continuing his demanding studies. 9 years later, in 1746, his father also died. Kant was 22, still a student, and now entirely on his own. Both parents were gone. The family's harness-making business had closed, and the family home was lost. These losses likely shaped him in lasting ways, contributing to his lifelong caution about forming deep attachments, his decision never to marry, and a sense of self-reliance. He would have to make his own way in the world, through his own efforts. In 1740, at age 16, Kant enrolled at the University of Königsberg, also known as the Albertina. He may initially have intended to study theology, following the path his pietist education had laid out for him. But philosophy quickly captured his imagination. At the university, philosophy was not a narrow discipline, but a vast field encompassing mathematics, physics, logic, metaphysics, ethics, and natural law. Kant threw himself into his studies with characteristic intensity, attending lectures, reading widely, and beginning to develop his own ideas. His primary teacher was Martin Knutzen, an associate professor of logic and metaphysics who had an enormous influence on the young Kant. Knutzen worked in the rationalist tradition of Leibniz and Wolff, philosophers who believed reason could discover fundamental truths about reality. But Knutzen's influence did not stop there. He was also familiar with the new experimental science emerging from Britain, particularly the physics of Isaac Newton. And he introduced Kant to the idea that the universe operates according to mathematical laws, discoverable through observation and reason. He also steered Kant away from certain philosophical traps, dissuading him from the theory of pre-established harmony, which he called a pillow for the lazy mind. These early lessons planted seeds that would grow throughout Kant's life. Kant spent 6 years at the University of Königsberg, from 1740 to 1746. He was a dedicated student, though not the most brilliant in his class, graduating second in his cohort. What mattered more was that he was developing his own interests and his own voice, drawn to mathematics and physics, and to questions about how the natural world operated. He began to see connections between different fields of study, and to wonder about the foundations of knowledge itself. During these years, Kant immersed himself in the work of the great rationalist philosophers. He studied Leibniz, who had proposed that the universe consists of simple substances called monads, each reflecting the entire cosmos from its own perspective. And he read Christian Wolff, who had systematized Leibniz's ideas into a comprehensive philosophical system that dominated German universities. At the same time, Kant was exposed to the British empiricists, philosophers like John Locke, who argued that all knowledge comes from experience, that the mind at birth is a blank slate, written on by experience. These competing approaches, rationalism and empiricism, would define the central problem Kant would spend his life trying to solve. Kant's university years were cut short by financial hardship. With both parents dead and no family support, he could not afford to continue his studies right away. He needed to earn money. And the most respectable option for a well-educated young man without means was to become a private tutor. In 1746, Kant left Königsberg to teach the children of wealthy families in the surrounding countryside. His first position was with the family of a reformed minister, then to Major Bernhard Friedrich von Hülsen, and later for Count Kaiserling, a wealthy nobleman with estates in Rautenburg. For the next 9 years, he moved from family to family, teaching Latin, mathematics, and manners to the sons and daughters of minor nobility and prosperous landowners. These were quiet years, but far from wasted. Kant used his free time to study independently and to begin writing, reading widely and working through Newton's Principia. Away from the pressure to conform to established schools of thought, he had the space to think for himself, to work out problems at his own pace, laying the foundations of what would become one of the most important philosophical systems ever constructed. During his years as a tutor, Kant began his first book, a work on physics dealing with a technical problem about the nature of force and motion. He started writing Thoughts on the True Estimation of Living Forces in 1744, at age 20. The debate he entered concerned how force in moving bodies should properly be measured. René Descartes had argued for mass times velocity, while Leibniz claimed it should be mass times velocity squared. Kant tried to find a middle way, suggesting both philosophers were partly right and were measuring different aspects of force. The book was not published until 1746 and made little immediate impact. It was dense and technical, and the printer charged Kant for the publication costs, money he could ill afford on a tutor's wages. Still, it was Kant's first serious engagement with the scientific and philosophical questions of his day, and it revealed his ambition. Even as a young man barely out of university, he was determined to contribute to human knowledge, rather than simply absorb what others had said. The book also showed a pattern that would define much of his mature philosophy, a desire to mediate between opposing viewpoints, to show that truth often lies not in choosing one side, but in understanding how both capture part of it. In 1754, Kant returned to Königsberg. He was 30 years old and ready to begin his academic career in earnest. The following year, he submitted and successfully defended 2 dissertations, earning the right to teach at the university as a private dozent, an unsalaried lecturer who earned money directly from students' fees. It was a precarious position, but it was a foot in the door. Kant held this position for the next 15 years, from 1755 to 1770, teaching an extraordinary range of subjects: logic and metaphysics, mathematics and physics, physical geography and anthropology, pedagogy and mineralogy, ethics and theology. At times, he taught as many as 28 hours a week, far more than a modern professor typically teaches. He needed the income and was genuinely interested in all of these subjects. His lectures were popular. Students found him engaging and clear, a gifted teacher who could make difficult ideas accessible through concrete examples. Contemporary accounts describe Kant as a lively and animated lecturer who spoke extemporaneously, following the thread of his thought wherever it led. He encouraged questions and discussion, and students remembered him not as a dry pedant, but as an engaging teacher who genuinely cared about their understanding. Known for his humor and his ability to leaven serious discussion with wit. One former student recalled that Kant could make his class laugh, even while discussing the most abstract metaphysical problems. Contrary to his later reputation, the young Kant was lively and sociable. He stayed up late playing cards and drinking wine with friends, attended social gatherings, and cut a fashionable figure in Königsberg society. He was witty and charming, a delightful dinner guest who told jokes, shared gossip, and discussed the latest books and ideas. He enjoyed theatre and music, attended concerts and plays, played billiards. For Kant, human fellowship was itself a good, something valuable in its own right. He believed conversation sharpens the mind, and that the exchange of ideas in good company is one of the great pleasures of life. Only around age 40 would he remake himself into the model of discipline and routine for which he became famous. But even then, he never became a recluse. In 1755, Kant published a scientific work that would prove far more significant than his first book. Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens proposed a bold theory about the origin of the solar system, arguing that the sun and planets had formed from a rotating cloud of gas and dust that slowly condensed under the force of gravity over millions of years. The idea was radical for its time. Before Kant, most people believed the solar system had been created essentially as it now appears, with God arranging the planets in their orbits and setting the whole mechanism in motion. The orderly movement of the planets in regular elliptical paths seemed to demand a divine designer. Kant showed instead that this order could arise naturally, through the simple operation of gravity and motion over vast stretches of time. He imagined the early solar system as a diffuse cloud of particles attracting each other through gravity, clumping into denser regions as the cloud rotated and flattened into a disk, with most mass concentrating at the center to form the sun and smaller concentrations forming the planets. This became known as the Nebular Hypothesis. What made the work philosophically significant was not just the science, but what it implied about the nature of explanation. Kant was showing that the grandest structures of the cosmos required no miraculous intervention to understand, that natural laws operating over sufficient time could produce order, beauty, and complexity on their own. The book also contained speculation about life on other planets, reasoning that an infinite universe filled with countless stars probably had many planets, and that many of those planets probably harbored life. Kant imagined a hierarchy of rational beings on distant worlds. These were wild speculations, but they revealed a cosmic imagination, willing to think beyond the parochial concerns of his own time and place. Unfortunately, the book had almost no immediate impact. The printer went bankrupt shortly after publication, and most copies sat unsold in a warehouse. It would be decades before Kant's Nebular Hypothesis became widely known. But when it did, it profoundly influenced astronomy and cosmology. Modern science has confirmed the basic picture he sketched. Throughout the late 1750s and into the 1760s, Kant continued publishing steadily, writing on logic, metaphysics, earthquakes, and the nature of space and time. In 1762, he published The False Subtlety of the Four Syllogistic Figures, a short work on formal logic that showed a pattern typical of his analytical approach, finding underlying simplicity beneath apparent complexity, and showing that what looked like several independent principles could often be unified into one. The following year brought two more works. One examined negative magnitudes in philosophy, and the other, titled The Only Possible Argument in Support of a Demonstration of the Existence of God, showed Kant still working within a broadly rationalist framework, while already questioning whether traditional proofs of God's existence truly succeeded. He examined the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, and the argument from design, and found each wanting in various ways. By 1764, Kant was well known enough to enter a Berlin Academy Prize competition on whether the principles of natural theology and morality could be proven with the same certainty as mathematical truths. His answer was nuanced and somewhat skeptical. Mathematical knowledge begins with clear definitions and proceeds by logical deduction to conclusions that are certain and universal, he argued. But moral and theological knowledge does not work this way. He came in second place, losing to Moses Mendelssohn, a prominent Jewish philosopher who would become one of the leading figures of the German Enlightenment. But Kant's entry was widely read and discussed, establishing him as a serious philosophical voice. That same year, Kant published Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime, a more accessible work examining aesthetic experience and human nature. It was his most popular work during his lifetime, going through multiple editions and translations, and it showed he could write for a general audience, as well as a technical one. In 1766, Kant was appointed second librarian of the Prussian Royal Library in Königsberg, a prestigious government position, and a sign that he was being recognized beyond the university. It came with a salary that eased his constant financial worries and gave him access to an enormous collection of books. In 1770, Kant was finally appointed professor of logic and metaphysics at the University of Königsberg at age 46, the position he had been working toward for 15 years. To mark the appointment, he wrote an inaugural dissertation, arguing that space and time are not features of reality itself, but forms of our sensibility, structures of the mind that shape how we experience the world. This was a radical idea, and it marked a turning point in Kant's thinking. But even as he wrote it, he recognized something was missing. He would spend the next 11 years on this problem, publishing almost nothing as he developed what would become his masterwork. Those years, from 1770 to 1781, are sometimes called Kant's silent decade. He continued teaching, fulfilling his duties as a professor. But behind the scenes, he was working through the most fundamental questions of philosophy. What can we know? How do we know it? What are the limits of human reason? He had been deeply affected by reading David Hume, the Scottish philosopher whose radical skepticism called into question our ability to know anything with certainty. Hume had argued that causation, the idea that one event causes another, is not something we can observe. We see one event happen, then another, but never the causal connection itself. Kant later said Hume had awakened him from his dogmatic slumber, and he set himself the task of answering Hume by showing that certain kinds of knowledge were indeed possible, a project that required rethinking the very foundations of philosophy. Finally, in 1781, after more than a decade of work, Kant published the Critique of Pure Reason. He was 57 years old. The book was massive, dense, and unlike anything written before it. Kant was attempting nothing less than a complete examination of the powers and limits of human reason. And the book asked three fundamental questions. What can I know? What should I do? What may I hope? The book's central claim was revolutionary. Kant argued that the mind is not a passive receiver of information, but an active organizer of experience. We do not simply see the world as it is, rather our minds structure the raw data of sensation according to certain built-in patterns. Space and time, for instance, are not features of the world itself, but forms our minds impose on experience. And concepts like causation and substance are not things we discover in the world, but categories our minds use to organize what we perceive. This meant we can never know things as they are in themselves. We can only know things as they appear to us, filtered through the structures of our cognition. Kant called this his Copernican revolution in philosophy, just as Copernicus had revolutionized astronomy by proposing that the Earth moves around the Sun rather than the reverse. Kant was proposing that objects conform to our minds, rather than our minds conforming to objects. The critique of pure reason was not an immediate success. It was too difficult, too obscure, too demanding, and many readers simply could not make sense of it. Kant had coined an entirely new vocabulary to express his ideas, and readers unaccustomed to his system found it baffling. Some critics went further and attacked the work as dangerous or wrong-headed. Kant was wounded by the misunderstanding. One reviewer complained that the critique was obscured by heavy gossamer. Even Kant's friends struggled with it. Johann Georg Hamann, a close friend and sharp-witted critic, called it a tough nut to crack. Recognizing the need to clarify his position, he wrote the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics in 1783 as an introduction and summary of the critique's main arguments. The real breakthrough came in 1786, when a young philosopher named Carl Leonhard Reinhold published a series of letters about Kantian philosophy in a widely read journal. Reinhold argued that Kant's critique could settle the great intellectual crisis of the age, presenting Kant's work not as an abstract exercise in epistemology, but as a solution. Almost overnight, Kant became famous. His books began to sell. Students flocked to hear his lectures, and other philosophers rushed to engage with his ideas. By the late 1780s, his reputation had spread beyond Germany, and the critical philosophy, as his system came to be called, was becoming the dominant framework for philosophical inquiry. Kant himself, now in his 60s, was recognized as one of the greatest philosophers of his age, perhaps of any age. The 1780s were the most productive years of Kant's life. In 1785, he published the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, his first major work on ethics, which introduced the Categorical Imperative, and remains one of the most influential works in ethics ever written. Kant argued that morality is not about achieving good consequences, or following the commands of God or authority. Instead, he proposed that morality is about acting according to principles that could become universal laws, rules that all rational beings could and should follow. The categorical imperative can be formulated in several ways, but its most famous version is this: act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In simpler terms, you should only do things you would be willing for everyone to do in similar circumstances. Consider a false promise. If you promise to repay a loan with no intention of doing so, could you will that everyone do the same whenever convenient? You could not. Because if everyone made false promises, the institution of promising would collapse entirely. The maxim contradicts itself when universalized. A second formulation of the categorical imperative has proven even more influential. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. This makes explicit what was implicit in the first formulation, that every rational being has inherent dignity and worth. To treat someone as a mere means is to use them as a tool for your purposes, without regard for their own goals and values. The key word in Kant's formulation is merely. We must never treat people merely as means. We must always also recognize and respect their status as autonomous, rational beings with their own ends and purposes. This principle has profound implications. It means every person has unconditional worth, simply by virtue of being rational, something that cannot be earned or lost. You do not become more valuable by being smart or beautiful or successful, and you do not lose value by making mistakes or suffering misfortune. Your worth is intrinsic, built into what you are as a rational creature. And this idea would become foundational for modern conceptions of human rights and human dignity. This led Kant to some conclusions that can seem harsh or counterintuitive. He argued that actions have moral worth only when done from duty, not from inclination. If you help someone because you enjoy helping people, because it makes you feel good, the action is not, on Kant's account, truly moral. Only when you help someone despite not wanting to, overcoming your inclinations out of respect for the moral law, does the action carry genuine moral worth. Kant also argued that we have duties to ourselves, not just to others. We must not degrade ourselves, waste our capacities, or neglect our moral character. The categorical imperative gives us a way to test whether actions are morally permissible. But Kant recognized that applying it in concrete situations is not always easy. Life is complex, circumstances vary, and rules can conflict. He never claimed his moral philosophy would solve every ethical dilemma or make moral decision-making simple. He claimed only that it identified the fundamental principle of morality. Kant's moral philosophy was revolutionary in several respects. It grounded morality in reason, rather than religion, emotion, or social convention. It emphasized autonomy and freedom, and it insisted on the absolute and unconditional nature of moral demands. These ideas would profoundly influence subsequent moral philosophy, political theory, law, and conceptions of human rights, echoing through modern liberal democracy and international human rights declarations. In 1786, Kant published The Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, followed in 1787 by a substantially revised second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. In 1788 came the Critique of Practical Reason, developing his moral philosophy and arguing that although we cannot prove the existence of God through theoretical reason, we have strong practical reasons to believe in God, freedom, and immortality. In 1790, he published The Critique of the Power of Judgment, his third and final critique, dealing with aesthetics and teleology, completing his systematic examination of all the powers of the human mind. Kant's life was not only about philosophy. Throughout these years, he maintained a carefully regulated daily routine that became legendary. After turning 40, he decided to transform his life. Before that, he had been sociable, sometimes staying out until midnight playing cards and drinking wine. But he came to believe that such irregularity was incompatible with serious intellectual work and moral character. His servant, Martin Lampe, a retired soldier, had standing orders to wake him every morning at exactly 5 o'clock, and to be persistent about it, never allowing Kant to oversleep, even if the philosopher begged for a few more minutes. Kant was proud that he never rose even half an hour late, though he admitted he found it hard to get up early. After waking, he would drink 1 or 2 cups of weak tea and smoke his pipe, having set himself the maxim of smoking only 1 pipe each morning, though it is reported with some amusement that the bowl of that pipe grew considerably larger over the years. Lunch was the main event of Kant's day. He rarely ate alone, and he did not limit himself to the company of fellow professors, but enjoyed mixing with people from all walks of life, merchants and townspeople, anyone with interesting conversation. He was, by every account, a brilliant conversationalist, able to discuss philosophy or politics or science with equal ease. After lunch came Kant's famous walk. At precisely 3:30 in the afternoon, he stepped out his door in his grey coat with his Spanish walking stick, following the same route through the streets and parks of Königsberg. The routine was so predictable that people joked they could set their clocks by it, and his path became known as the philosopher's walk. Legend has it that he deviated from this route only twice, once to obtain an early copy of Rousseau's Émile, and once to hear news of the French Revolution. This extraordinary routine was not mere habit, but a philosophical commitment. Kant believed true character consisted of following rationally chosen maxims throughout one's life, and by establishing this schedule and adhering to it without exception, he was practicing what he preached. The routine became the container that held his creative and intellectual work. Martin Lampe worked for Kant for some 40 years, from around 1762 until 1802. But as both men grew old, problems emerged. Lampe became difficult, neglecting his duties, drinking too much, and quarreling constantly with the cook. Eventually, the situation became unbearable, and Kant dismissed him. He made provisions for Lampe in his will to ensure the old servant would have a pension. And when Lampe's conduct later required Kant to revise that will, he initially wrote a harsh phrase about his former servant's behavior, then reconsidered, crossed out the passage, and wrote it more kindly, so that nothing written in anger would survive him. It is a small act, but it reveals something of the man behind the austere reputation. In 1792, Kant published Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, arguing that true religion must be grounded in reason and morality, rather than revelation or supernatural claims. This brought him into conflict with the Prussian authorities. King Friedrich Wilhelm II considered the work dangerous and subversive, demanding that Kant stop writing about religion under threat of punishment. Kant complied, at least nominally, promising not to write on religious topics during the king's lifetime, though he felt the injustice keenly. When Friedrich Wilhelm II died in 1797, Kant considered himself released from the promise and resumed writing on religious questions. The episode showed that even the great champion of intellectual freedom could be silenced by political power, that the Enlightenment's ideals were not yet secure. In 1795, Kant published a short but influential essay called Perpetual Peace, proposing a federation of nations as a way to prevent war and achieve lasting peace. He argued that republican governments, states where citizens have a voice in governance, are less likely to go to war, because the people who would have to fight and die have a say in the decision. These ideas were visionary, anticipating by more than a century the creation of the League of Nations and the United Nations. Kant believed peace was not merely a dream, but a moral imperative, something to strive for, even if it could never be fully achieved. And he saw humanity as capable of slowly learning to overcome war and violence through reason. His essay on Perpetual Peace set out his mature vision for international relations in 3 articles. First, every state should have a republican constitution. Second, the law of nations should be founded on a federation of free states. Third, there should be a universal right of hospitality, allowing people to travel and trade across borders. These ideas anticipated by more than a century the League of Nations and the United Nations. And while these institutions have many limitations and have not ended war, they mark genuine progress toward a world governed by law rather than force. By the late 1790s, Kant's health was failing. He had never been especially robust, but as he entered his 70s, his body and mind began to give way. He developed what we would now recognize as dementia. His memory faltered, his thoughts grew confused, and he struggled to complete his work. He had been laboring on a final book, filling hundreds of pages with notes, drafts, and revisions, but could never finish it. The manuscript was found on his desk after his death, its pages unnumbered and disordered. Kant stopped teaching in 1796, at age 72. He could no longer take his daily walks, could barely see or write, and friends who visited found that he sometimes did not recognize them. Yet those who knew him reported that he remained kind and gentle, that his character, forged through decades of discipline and moral practice, held, even as everything else fell away. On February 12, 1804, Immanuel Kant died in Königsberg, the city he had never left. His last words were reported to be, "Es ist gut," it is good. He was 79 years old. His funeral drew thousands of mourners, and the entire city grieved him. After Kant's death, his influence only grew. His three critiques became foundational texts for Western philosophy, and thinkers in every subsequent generation have had to grapple with him, whether they agreed with him or not. Kant never married. There are stories he considered it twice, but each time he deliberated so long that the opportunity passed. He lived alone, apart from his servants, and by all accounts was content with his solitude. Though he was not cold or unfeeling, he valued friendship deeply and was generous to his servants and relatives, careful to provide for them in his will. He simply organized his life around work and thought rather than domestic partnership. Kant's philosophy was built on a simple but profound idea: sapere aude, dare to know. This was his motto for the Enlightenment, his call to humanity to think for itself, rather than relying on the authority of kings, priests, or tradition. In his 1784 essay, What is Enlightenment?, he argued that enlightenment is humanity's emergence from its self-imposed immaturity, the state of being unable or unwilling to use one's own understanding without guidance from another. Enlightenment, he wrote, is not a state already achieved, but an ongoing process, a continuing project of liberation from self-imposed tutelage. He insisted that most people remain in this immature state, not for lack of ability, but for lack of courage and out of laziness. It is easier to let others think for us, to accept what we are told by authorities, than to take on the responsibility that comes with thinking for ourselves. But this ease, Kant warned, comes at a terrible cost: the loss of our own humanity, the failure to exercise our distinctive capacity as rational beings. Kant recognized that enlightenment faces real obstacles. Guardians, those who claim authority over others, have an interest in keeping people dependent, and they warn that independent thinking is dangerous. Kant rejected these arguments. Yes, people will make mistakes as they learn to think for themselves, but perpetual dependence on authority is worse than any mistake freedom might produce. He drew an important distinction between the private and public use of reason. The private use is reason exercised in one's official capacity: a soldier following orders, a clergyman teaching church doctrine. In these roles, one must follow the rules of the position, even while personally disagreeing. The public use of reason is exercised when one steps back from an official role to address the world as a thinking citizen, free to question everything and propose alternatives. A clergyman must teach orthodox doctrine in church, but should be free to publish essays questioning it. A soldier must obey orders, but should be free to argue against war. This was Kant's attempt to balance order and freedom. Kant lived through extraordinary times. Born in 1724 during the age of absolute monarchy, he died in 1804 after the American Revolution had founded a new republic. The French Revolution had overthrown the monarchy and proclaimed the rights of man, and Napoleon was remaking Europe by conquest. His philosophy both reflected and shaped these changes. His emphasis on individual autonomy supported democratic movements across Europe and America. His vision of perpetual peace offered an alternative to endless war. Yet Kant himself was no radical. He never called for revolution, believing in gradual reform through reason and persuasion. And when the French Revolution descended into terror, he was troubled, seeing in it confirmation that change must come through enlightenment rather than force. He argued that we have a duty to obey even unjust laws while working peacefully to change them, since revolution dissolves the social contract and returns society to a state where might makes right. Kant's vision for humanity was fundamentally optimistic, though not naively so. He believed human beings, despite their tendency toward violence and selfishness, were capable of moral progress. That over time, through education and the gradual spread of republican government and international law, humanity could become more rational, more moral, more peaceful. He wrote of radical evil, the human propensity to make exceptions for ourselves and put our own interests above the moral law, and knew that enlightenment required constant effort. He believed nonetheless that we have a duty to work for progress, to strive for a better world, even if we will not see it fully realized. He called this the highest good, the idea that virtue and happiness should ultimately coincide. We cannot prove this will happen, Kant admitted, but we must act as if it will. Kant's tomb in Königsberg bears an inscription from the Critique of Practical Reason, perhaps his most famous words. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the more often and steadily we reflect on them: the starry heavens above me, and the moral law within me. For Kant, these represented the twin poles of human existence: the vast, lawful, indifferent universe, operating by mathematical principles we can discover but never fully comprehend, and the voice of reason within, that tells us what we ought to do, the capacity for moral judgment that makes us more than mere natural objects. Showing how knowledge of nature can coexist with space for freedom and morality was the scope of his entire philosophical project. Yet Kant was not without serious blind spots. He held views now recognized as deeply wrong. He believed women naturally inferior to men in rationality and excluded them from full citizenship. He accepted racial hierarchies, placing Europeans above other peoples, and he excluded wage laborers from political rights. These views are repugnant, a reminder that even the greatest thinkers are shaped by the prejudices of their time. Kant, who argued so powerfully for the equal dignity of all rational beings, failed to apply that dignity universally. This does not mean his philosophy should be dismissed, but it does mean reading him critically. Kant's influence on modern thought is difficult to overstate. In epistemology, the Critique of Pure Reason set the terms of debate for the next 2 centuries. In ethics, the Categorical Imperative remains a cornerstone of deontological thinking and human rights discourse. In political philosophy, Rawls's theory of justice is explicitly Kantian in inspiration. The rise of German idealism in Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel represented both continuation and critique of his system. And his influence runs further still, through phenomenology and existentialism, in Husserl's analysis of consciousness, Heidegger's engagement with human finitude, and Sartre's insistence on radical freedom and responsibility. Beyond academic philosophy, Kant's ideas permeated Western culture in ways both obvious and subtle. When the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, declaring that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It gave political expression to a fundamentally Kantian idea. His insistence that persons must never be treated merely as means became a powerful argument against slavery, exploitation, and tyranny. The language of human rights, of dignity, of autonomy, of duty is Kantian language that has become part of our shared moral vocabulary. Kant's influence has not gone unchallenged. His ethics have been criticized as too abstract and rigid, too focused on duty at the expense of love and care. His politics have been questioned for their limited conception of who counts as a full citizen. His metaphysics have been attacked for resting on the problematic distinction between appearances and things in themselves. Yet even critics must reckon with him. His questions remain our questions. What can we know? What makes actions morally right or wrong? What do we owe to others? What is human freedom in a world governed by natural laws? What makes something beautiful? Kant's answers, whether or not we accept them, have shaped how we approach every one of these questions. To understand contemporary philosophy, politics, ethics, or aesthetics is, in large part, to understand Kant.